Thank you. First, let me say how delighted I was to be invited to give the Krishna Bharadwaj Memorial Lecture and to help you celebrate the Golden Jubilee of the Centre for Economic Studies and Planning. And I'm so sorry that my health has not permitted me to travel to Delhi in person and to meet old friends and to make new ones and learn more about economic research in India. I've looked at the program and I see there's so many interesting sessions that I would have liked to attend. I was privileged to meet Professor Bharadwaj many years ago when she was a visiting professor at Manchester University in the UK, and I learned there firsthand her kindness and her path-breaking research. I particularly recall her research on power in interlocking markets in rural India. I'm also very pleased to help celebrate the Golden Jubilee of the Centre for Economic Studies and Planning, because I also knew when I was a student some of the founder members of the centre, Utsa and Prabhat Patnaik, whom I met when I was a student in Oxford, and they were studying in Oxford and Cambridge. I remember us all attending a seminar on imperialism and having a lot of interesting discussions about development. So congratulations to you all at the Centre for this Golden Jubilee. And I'm so pleased that the memory of Krishna Bharadwaj is being kept alive by this series of lectures. My lecture does not deal with the topics that Professor Bharadwaj contributed so much to our understanding of the Indian economy, of the rural sector, but it does deal with interlocking structures of power, those of class and gender, though not specifically in India. And I hope there'll be some time in discussion to learn from you how far the issues I discuss have relevance for the Indian economy. But now let me start my presentation. Could I have the first slide, please? Thank you. So my talk is on the intersections of gender and class in the distribution of income and work. Next slide, please. Let me give you an overview of what I'm hoping to present, although if we're running short of time, I might shorten some of this. So I want to talk about gender and class in the measurement of the distribution of income and work. I will do this via a rereading Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century with a gender lens. I will consider an OECD claim that more women in paid work means less income inequality between households. And I'll also ask if rising female labour force participation leads to a rise in inequality between capital and labour. And finally, I'll discuss strategies that could reduce simultaneously both gender inequality and class inequality. And I'll be drawing upon an article I published in the Japanese Political Economy, but with some examples beyond that. Next slide, please. So first, a word on intersections of gender and class. Gender is often understood as a personal characteristic, something that you can put into your equations as a dummy variable, 0 for female, 1 for male. But I understand it as a structure of social power, an unequal structure of social power that is always intertwined with other unequal structures of power, such as class. A person's gender position shapes how they experience class, and their class position shapes how they experience gender. Economies themselves are gendered structures in which capital accumulation depends on non-market processes of social reproduction of people. And both capital accumulation and social reproduction are structured by a gender division of labor in which women disproportionately undertake unpaid work, and women in paid work are disproportionately segregated in a narrow range of occupations and concentrated in precarious work. Widely used measures of economic inequality do not capture these intersections. Next slide, thank you. So some measures of inequality in the distribution of income and work. You're all familiar with this. This is just a refresher. Measures of inter-household inequality in income, which have been increasing in many countries. Gini coefficients who measure the overall distribution of income, or the share of the top 1%, or the ratio of the share of the bottom 40% to the top 10%. Measures of inequality between factors of production, increasing in many countries, the share of income falling and the share of capital income and national income rising. Measures of gender inequality, some decreasing, some not. So we can look at wage gaps, differential rates of unemployment or employment, shares in precarious or informal or vulnerable work, share as hours of unpaid care and domestic work. But a note of caution here, fall in a gender gap may mean leveling up or leveling down. Let me illustrate this with the gender wage gap. So if the gender wage gap falls, this may mean that women's wages on average are rising to be nearer to those of men, leveling up, or it may mean that men's wages on average are falling to be nearer those of women, leveling down. And I think if it's leveling down, this is very conducive to backlash against women's rights that we're seeing in so many countries. Next slide, please. So I've chosen a discussion of Piketty to illustrate some of the points I want to make, because he's very well known to everybody. I know there's been discussion of his work in India. He focused on the top 1%, and he showed increasing concentration of income in the hands of the top 1% in USA, UK, France, Germany, and Japan since 1910. This focus on the top 1% foregrounds class much more than does the Gini coefficient. And it's much easier for people to understand. If I'm going to speak about this in a community organization, it's going to take me 10 minutes to explain what is the Gini coefficient, and still people are scratching their heads. But if I talk about the share of the top 1%, people get it immediately. And I think his focus on the top 1% is one reason why his book was such a bestseller. He was also innovative in using tax records as a data source rather than household surveys, on the grounds that this would better enable him to capture the incomes of the top 1% than household surveys, which notoriously leave out the richest. Of course, tax records also tend to underestimate the incomes of the richest, but at least they are included. He refers to inequality between individuals, but the data is actually on inequality between tax units, which may be households rather than individuals, depending on the structure of taxation in a particular country. In the UK, they would be individuals, but in the USA, they would be households. Inequality within tax units is ignored. We're not going to shed a lot of tears maybe for the wives of rich men, but they may have little income of their own, which weakens their bargaining power and may make them vulnerable to domestic violence and coercive control. Piketty is not alone in ignoring inequality within the units he considers. All inter-household measures of income distribution ignore gender inequality within households. And gender inequality within households is something that feminist economics have done a lot of work on, and I know there's been work in India on this. So I want to bring that issue of inequality within households into our discussion of class inequality. Next slide, please. Piketty's best-selling book seems contemporary capitalism as patrimonial, arguing that inheritance of wealth is now a key driver in inequality in incomes. And he says in all societies, there are two main ways of accumulating wealth, through work and through inheritance, and argues that in rich countries, inherited wealth was important in the 18th and 19th century, declined in the period 1914 to 1970, and is once again increasing in importance. And that's certainly true in the UK. Theft and pillage are mentioned in a footnote as, quote, not totally without historical significance. Imperialism and slavery are not central to Piketty's history of inequality, which seems to me extraordinary, coming as I do from a background in development economics and having in my youth attended this wonderful seminar on imperialism in Oxford with Prabhat and Utsa. Piketty's main concern is to displace ideas of, quote, meritocratic capitalism, which it does effectively, I think, but it does not recognize that incomes of the rich are rooted in appropriation of surplus, as something which economists who are knowledgeable about the classical tradition would see, and often resting on violence or the threat of violence. Next slide, please. Patrimonialism without patriarchy. Piketty does not highlight the gender dimensions of patrimonialism, even though many of the examples he discusses from 19th century novels show that patrimony was patriarchal. Women had fewer, if any, inheritance rights. Men controlled the property of their wives who did not have their own earnings. Overt patriarchy, inscribed in discriminatory laws, has declined in many countries. But contemporary capitalism everywhere is maintained through gender inequalities in paid and unpaid work, buttressed by misogyny and violence against women. And I want to bring the importance of misogyny and violence into our discussion of economic inequality, because these are too often treated as two separate domains for social scientists to investigate. And there's one set of studies that focus on violence against women and what we can do about that, and another set of studies that focus on economic inequality. I think we need to recognize that violence in various kinds, and violence against women is an important aspect of this, underpin the kind of inequality that we see in economies. Now, of course, it would be interesting to know what proportion of the 1% are women, but I don't think that's the most important question. It's much more important to consider the gender dimensions of unequalizing capital accumulation. Next slide, please. So, to throw light on this, let me first turn to Piketty's explanation of women's low earnings and how feminist economists contest this. He does note that in the countries he covers, women are significantly overrepresented in the bottom 50% of earners, predominantly as less skilled industrial workers in the period 1920 to 1980, and subsequently, he says, mainly as restaurant and shop workers. He argues that earnings of low-income workers can be explained in terms of marginal productivity theory because their work, for instance, that of assembly line workers or fast food servers, is replicable and workers are interchangeable. However, he considers this is not the case for top managers and explains that their high earnings in terms of social norms shaping the decisions of remuneration committees. Social norms is perhaps a little bit too anemic to describe the social power that is in fact shaping the decisions of remuneration committees. Now, feminist economists reject this explanation of the low pay of women, and I refer you to an article by Diane Perrins in the British Journal of Sociology. Turn to the next slide, please. So Diane Perrins looks at the case of paid care workers. Now, Piketty does not mention paid care workers, though paid care employment is as large as construction employment in many OECD countries. And paid care work is a huge sector in most of the economies that I've ever looked at. Feminist economists have argued that interpersonal relations are central to care work, and thus this work is not mechanically replicable. Diane Perrins argues that the pay is low, not because of low marginal productivity, but because gendered social norms construct care work as, quote, unskilled work for which women are naturally suited. And this ignores the tacit skills in caring which women develop through a gendered process of socialization that begins at a very early age. They are, in fact, trained at home. In many countries, entry barriers to paid care work are low, as little formal training is required by employers. And women who have very little bargaining power are frequently steered into paid care work, and their low wages are historically and socially determined. I think care work is a good example of how marginal productivity theory of wage determination simply doesn't make sense. Next slide, please. Let me move away from how Piketty engages with the issue of the low wages of women to his overall framework, his explanation of the drivers of inequality. And I know that some of you in India have engaged with this and made a critique of this. He argues that in the long run, the rate of return on capital, R, is greater than the rate of growth of output, G, leading through, quote, an implacable logic to rising inequality in the share of income going to capital, which is primarily owned by the rich. He claims that this rate of return on capital, R, tends to persist on average between 4 and 5%, except when there is, quote, an exogenous shock, war, revolution, etc. And he claims that G depends on productivity and population increases, which are both treated as exogenous. His conclusion is decreased growth, especially demographic growth, is thus responsible for capital's comeback, which is a very challenging conclusion for those of us who think that actually decreasing fertility is a very important basis for women's empowerment. But there's been a feminist critique of Piketty's understanding of R and G. The feminist critique is that they are both gendered and endogenously, not exogenously determined. Next slide, please. So let's turn to the feminist critique about G, the rate of growth of output, and demographic change. First, we say that fertility decisions are not simply private individual choices that are exogenously made. They depend on gendered economic institutions, such as women's access to public services and to women's earning opportunities. And Diane Elson points out that in those Western European countries with better childcare services and thus less requirement of unpaid work per child, there's higher fertility. Moreover, labor supply is not exogenously determined by population growth. Your own Jayati Ghosh has made a critique of Piketty where she points out that capitalism generates a supply of labor to adjust to demand, increasing through measures to increase or to reduce the labor force participation of women. So the supply of labor to the economy is not exogenously determined by population growth. Next slide, please. So the second part of the feminist critique is about the rate of return and social reproduction. Underpinning the rate of return are processes of production in which a surplus is extracted and in which struggle takes place, which heterodox economists of all kinds emphasize. Feminist economists also draw attention to the way that the costs of social reproduction are externalized to households and communities. Antonella Piccio's pioneering book on social reproduction, where she engages with the classical economists and the extent to which they did not take this into account, I'd recommend you all to read. The task of turning the historically and socially determined wage into the means for reproduction of this and future generations of workers falls primarily to women. The more the costs of social reproduction can be externalized, the higher is R, other things being equal. But there are limits. Next slide. So I'd argue there are limits to the extent to which the costs of social reproduction can be externalized, therefore boosting the rate of return on capital. There's a tension between the benefits to owners of capital of externalizing the costs of social reproduction and securing the type of educated and healthy labor force that many new technologies and process of industrialization require. Moreover, women's unpaid work is not able to completely substitute for goods and services that can be bought in the market or supplied by the public sector, something I discussed quite a bit in my long ago theory of male bias in the development process. Women's unpaid work does extend when the services that can be supplied, that are supplied by the public sector, fall. But there's a limit to this. If the sanitation system breaks down because the maintenance isn't done, that's not something that is easy for women to repair by increasing their individual hours of unpaid work. Ditto with the energy system. Similarly, you cannot buy in the market a functioning water system or energy system. These are system-wide processes that either increase or reduce the amount of unpaid work. And by increasing your unpaid work, you can't completely substitute for goods and services that can be bought in the market or supplied in the public sector. And I'll go out on a limb here, but I don't think that paid work can completely substitute for unpaid work in a process of capitalist accumulation, unless we think that capitalism is compatible with the production of people on the same basis as farm animals. Although there's widespread mistreatment of people in the capitalist process of accumulation, still the production of chickens and cows is on a different basis to the production of people. So I'd argue that both value and non-value forms of labor are required for capital accumulation on an ongoing basis. But the balance between the value and the non-value forms of labor changes over time. Next slide, please. So what we've seen in the rich countries is a re-externalizing of the costs of social reproduction. Following the Second World War in the rich countries, there was investment in public services that socialized to a much greater degree the costs of social reproduction. But since the 1980s, there have been tendency to re-externalize these costs in rich countries, facilitating the reduction in the tax contribution of corporations in the rich, which is very well documented. There's also been offshoring production in which the costs of reproducing the labor force fall on other countries, which have a lower GDP per capita. So, for instance, the employment of migrant women for paid care work in the rich countries, who have acquired most of the skills required for this, formal and informal, in their countries of origin. And it's those countries that are bearing the costs of that skill creation. There's also been the marketization of public services, worsening the terms and conditions of those who provide them, sometimes introducing user fees, and cuts to public services, putting more burdens back on women's unpaid labor. So the point I want to emphasize at the end of this discussion is that the relationship between R and G, and hence inequality in the distribution of income, is shaped by the outcome of struggles around social reproduction as well as around production. And I think it's this role of struggles around social reproduction that feminist economists emphasize more than do others. And women not just take this deterioration of public services and this re-externalizing the costs of social reproduction quietly. They do mobilize and struggle to try and combat it, just as workers don't take without struggle things like the offshoring of production. But the balance of forces has not been in their favor. Next slide, please. That is essentially concludes what I wanted to say about Piketty, to talk about what I think has been a very influential all over the world analysis and view about inequality, what drives it, to argue for looking at Piketty through a gender lens and seeing that actually there's a gender critique to be made, particularly of his understanding of the labor market and of his understanding of what drives inequality. Now I want to turn to a very different approach to inequality, which is an OECD study, which makes the claim that more women in paid work means less income inequality. It's an OECD study that came out in 2015 called In It Together, Why Less Inequality Benefits All, and is an example of the increasing concern of mainstream economists about the growth of inequality. This is a counterfactual study that compares the Gini coefficient with and without increases in women's labour force participation in selected OECD countries from the mid-1980s to 2007. So now we turn to a study that uses Gini coefficient, which doesn't highlight class in the same way that Piketty's framing does. It's in a context in which gender inequality in OECD labour markets, on average, is falling, although there's the average gender gap in paid employment, for instance, narrowed in the period 1992 to 2013 to 16%. The gender wage gap of full-time employees fell 4 percentage points to 15%. The OECD, though, study does not discuss whether this is levelling up or levelling down. So before we interpret this as good news, we have to understand more about whether this is a process of levelling up in which women's wages have been rising to the level of men's, or levelling down in which men's wages have been falling to the level of women. The proportion of households with a woman in paid work rose on average from around 52% to 61% from the mid-80s to the late 2000s. And women's contribution to household income rose on average. Next slide, please. Now, the OECD study looks at the impact of this increased female labour force participation on the Gini coefficient. And it finds that in almost all OECD countries, assuming everything else stayed the same, these changes reduce inter-household income inequality below what it otherwise would have been. So study finds that without the increase in female labour force participation, the average OECD Gini coefficient would have risen from 28.2 in the mid-1980s to 31.6 in 2007. And the increase in female labour force participation limited the rise to 30.8%, which mitigates but does not stop or reverse rises in inequality. But the neoliberal message that this report emphasizes is that increasing women's labour force participation will not only make the economy grow faster, it will reduce income inequality between households below what it would otherwise be. Now, I want to unpack what the OECD doesn't look at. I want to look at the implications for women's total working day, because the OECD study fails to examine the impact of an increase in female labour force participation on women's unpaid work and on their total working day, paid plus unpaid work. Women's participation in paid work may decrease women's unpaid care and domestic work if they're able to purchase labour-saving household technology or employ other women, often migrant women, to do this work, or men take on a greater share of this work. But even if women's unpaid care and domestic work decreases, it may not decrease enough to offset the increase in paid work. So the question is, what are the implications of this for women's total working day? Data availability limits conclusions on how far women's total working day rose in the OECD countries, along with their female labour force participation. But on the next slide, I'll show you a few limited results. And you can see by my focus on women's total working day, I am also drawing upon the lessons I learned in my youth in reading Das Kapital about the importance of looking at work time and the total working day, as well as looking at income. So I tried to look at what was happening to the shares of time spent on unpaid care and domestic work. The OECD database has time trends in female labour force participation, but not trends in women's hours of paid and unpaid work. It does have data for the latest available year in the period 1999 to 2013 on the share of their average 24-hour day that men and women spend on unpaid care and domestic work. And I'm not quoted all the figures here, but for the UK, men spend 11.1% of their average 24-hour day on unpaid care and domestic work, and UK women almost double that at 20.2%. In Japan, men spend only 5.2%, half of that UK men spend, and Japanese women spend almost more than three times as much on 17.2%, but interestingly, still lower than spent by UK women. But in all the countries that this database covered, the share of their time that women spend on unpaid care and domestic work is higher than that of men. I think nothing surprising there. Next slide, please. What I tried to do then was to find data on trends in time spent on paid and unpaid work, because that's what I need to know if I can look and see what happened alongside these trends in increasing female participation to the trends in their time spent on paid and unpaid work. It's quite difficult to find these time trends, but I was able to find one article, and put the reference there, that looked in the European Economic Review that provided data for Australia, Canada, Finland, France, Netherlands, Norway, and UK in the period from 1970s to 1990s or 2000s for the working age population. I mean, this ability to do this depends on having had regular time use surveys for quite some decades. In Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, Norway, and UK, women's total hours of work, paid and unpaid, went up. In these countries, more equality in labour market participation and income came at the cost of an extension of the total working day of women. In these countries, the mitigating impact of increase in female labour market participation on inter-household income inequality came at the cost of more work in total for working age women. And I think this hidden cost is something that studies which simply celebrate the increase in female labour force participation fail to recognise. The increase in female labour force participation that the OECD study found which had a mitigating impact on inter-household inequality, came at the cost of more work in total for working age women, the double burden, as we call it. More research is needed as more data becomes available, but I think it's unlikely that increases in female labour force participation have no impact on women's total working day. Next slide, please. I want to turn now to my final example, which is studies that look at the relationship between rising female participation in the labour market and falls in labour share of income. Some feminist economists have examined this relation. An early paper by Finov and Jayadev found that female share of the labour force was strongly and negatively correlated to labour's share of national income, as female labour force participation was higher, labour share of national income was lower. There's a more recent study by Alyssa Braunstein that's used data for 1991 to 2014 for a wide range of industrializing developing countries, not OECD countries. And it found that higher total employment for women relative to men is associated across all regions with lower labour shares in national income. Next slide, please. How do we interpret that? Do these results show that long-standing fears of male workers that women entering the labour market compete with men and undercut men's wages to the benefits of capital are correct? Finov and Jayadev suggest a different direction of causation. A decline in the bargaining power and wages of male workers due to globalization is a key factor in pushing more women into the labour market, as the household needs two wages, as male wages have fallen. And Braunstein finds that the outcome depends on the degree to which women are employed in industry rather than in agriculture or low-tech services. She finds that an increase in women's relative share of industrial employment is associated with a small increase in labour share of income because women's pay is higher in this sector, but a decline in women's relative share of industrialization is strongly associated with a fall in labour share as women have become more concentrated in low-paying service sector jobs where they have little bargaining power. So this one study talks about what are the factors that push women into the labour market. Another one talks about the place in the labour market that women enter into and whether it's one with a relatively higher wages or low wages. Next slide, please. There's also a recent study of the female share of employment in labour share of income by industry in OECD countries. And this is by Gushansky and Aaron at the University of Greenwich, another progressive place for studying economics. And they used data for 1970 to 2014 to look at the determinants of wage share by industry, excluding the public sector and the primary industries. So by industry, they mean sector, economic sector, but including the public sector and the primary industries. So there are service sectors in this. The wage share, they look at the wage share measured as a ratio of labour compensation to value added, and they found it decreased in the majority of sectors. But then they tested whether female employment share in the sector has an additional explanatory power in addition to union density, that's the proportion of the workforce that belongs to a trade union, globalization, and technological change in the sector. And they measured female employment share as hours worked by women to total hours worked in the sector. Important to look at hours worked and not just numbers of workers, because a lot of women in the labour markets in some OECD countries work on a part-time basis. Next slide, please. And they found that the relationship depends on the worker's education level. They found that it was a small, significant negative association of female share of employment and labour share of value added by sector. And it was driven by the female share of, quote, low-skilled employment, where skill was defined in terms of the level of education, as it typically is. The estimation for female share of medium skill and high skill employment did not find a statistically significant relationship with the workers' share and the value added of that industry. And Gushansky and Anaran suggest a possible explanation is a greater gender differences in pay of low-skilled workers and that of medium and high-skilled workers, and argue that the problem is that women have been integrated into the labour market in these low-skilled sectors without strong collective bargaining and without strong enforcement of equal pay legislation. I'd add that low-skilled men and women tend to be concentrated in different occupations. So this makes the application of equal pay legislation more complex, though not impossible. And it has to be framed in terms of equal pay for work of equal value. And indeed, in the UK, women in some occupations classified as low-skilled have been quite successful over the past 10 years in getting application of equal pay legislation that's framed in terms of equal pay for work of equal value, and saying we don't do the same work as these men, but our work is of equal value. And this is very important, I think, when we take into account the segregation of men and women, particularly low-skilled men and women, into different occupations. Next slide, please. So I think what we need are strategies to reduce both gender inequality and class inequality. And I'm going to talk about this in relation to OECD countries. I'm going to ask you at the end what you think about these issues in India. So if we want to reduce both gender inequality and class inequality, one important strategy is to increase the pay of low-income women workers, promote women's organizations through trade unions, including informal and migrant workers. And there have been some successes, for instance, in the organization of paid domestic workers, including migrant paid domestic workers. Raising the minimum wage. Raising the minimum wage is very, very important for gender equality in the labor market because women are the majority of the low-paid workers. And raising the minimum wage might be more important for gender equality for low-income women than equal pay legislation, although equal pay legislation can be used. Thirdly, using public procurement as a leverage to improve wages in the private sector. Women are the majority of employees in outsourced care, cleaning, and clerical work that the public sector, in its various manifestations, procures from private contractors. So use public procurement as a leverage to improve wages in the private sector. Expand truly public sector employment because the pay and conditions for women are often better than in the private sector. And strengthen labour market regulations and their enforcement, including, as I said, equal pay legislation based on equal pay for work of equal value. These are all strategies that can be used to increase the pay of low-income women in ways that will reduce gender inequality and class inequality. Next slide, please. But we should also look at strategies that focus on re-socializing social reproduction in the OECD countries. So invest in public services to reduce women's unpaid care and domestic work and create better quality employment for women. Study for the International Trade Union Confederation by a group I work with, the UK Women's Budget Group, found that investing 2% of GDP in care services for preschool children would create more jobs directly and indirectly than the same investment in construction. And this was across a wide range of OECD countries. I just give you the figures there for the UK and Japan. So you can see in the UK, many more jobs would be created in care, both directly and indirectly, than in construction. In Japan, more jobs in care than in construction, although the gap isn't as big as in the UK. So when we've been talking about investment for recovery after the post-COVID shock to the economy, we've been arguing for not just thinking about investing in construction that creates lots of jobs for men, but thinking about investment in care services, which creates lots of jobs for women and also jobs for men when you look at the linkages, the multiplier effects and the linkages. But we've also been stressing that public services must be publicly provided, not publicly financed, but privately provided, because this has also been a growing tendency, cause for concern about inequality, is that public services are financed through taxation, but they're privately provided. We have a situation in the UK where hedge fund companies are investing in care services for deprived children and for frail elderly people on the basis that the state will pay for this care, and they're reaping huge profits from this. Next slide, please. And finally, on thinking about this in OECD countries, there also is an important role to play for redistributing assets, something I've talked about more extensively, more recently in another paper, but not time to go into that here. But clearly there needs to be an expansion of collectively owned assets as a counterweight to privately owned assets. Things like cooperatives, social enterprises, municipal enterprises, public services, and public housing. But in doing this, you have to ensure that working class women and men have a say in managing these collectively owned assets, which has not often been the case in the past. You also got to build support for tax justice, a tax system which is built on gender equality and class inequality and taxes wealth and profits. I know this is an ongoing struggle in many countries around the world. Build support for public borrowing to invest in public services as well as in physical infrastructure. In the UK, as in many countries, the fiscal rules say you can borrow money if you're going to build something, if you're going to build a road or a bridge or a hospital, but you can't borrow money to pay for the nurses and the doctors and other staff to use the building and provide a service. So we've been questioning this and arguing that we should think of investment in public services as social investment in social infrastructure just as important as physical infrastructure. And of course, we need to build support for taking privatized services back into public ownership. Next slide, please. So I end with a slide with some questions for you about how the implications or what you think in India about these issues of the interactions of gender and class in the distribution of income and work. So these are, I haven't worked on India. I'm not deeply knowledgeable about the Indian economy, although I read some of the literature. So some questions that occurred to me. The female labour force participation in India seems low. I say seems low because I could see there was an interesting session in the program of the conference about what time use surveys reveal about female labour force participation compared with what other kinds of surveys reveal. So the regular surveys, it seems low. How does this affect the inter-household and the functional distribution of income in India? The so-called informal economy is large in India. How does this complicate measuring and understanding the functional distribution of income? What are the best strategies in India to increase the incomes of low-income women, given that the structure of the economy is very different to the structure of most OECD countries? How can equal pay legislation be designed and implemented to help low-income women? And what kinds of public investment in social reproduction should have priority? Care services or water and sanitation, housing, energy, and transport? So I'm going to end my talk there, and I'm looking forward to some interesting questions, challenges, suggestions, and from learning more in the discussion about how gender and class interact in the distribution of income and work in India. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Elson. That was a fascinating tour de force kind of talk. And you have thrown so many questions, so many issues. You have suggested some ways forward, etc. So now we will have some time for interaction with the audience. We have at least, let's say, 10 to 15 minutes, if that's okay with you, Professor Elson.
Yes,
my apologies
yes,
again that we started late and you had to wait, but we can take it for another 15 minutes or so. So the ball is in your court. Yes. If you could please also identify yourself for Professor Elson, which your name and institutional affiliation, that would be very helpful.
Hello, thank you. My name is Bhupendra and I am a student of politics here at JNU. Thank you, Professor Elson, for your wonderful presentation. I was wondering how race plays an important role in the distribution of income and work among women, and how neo-colonial labor market structure still continues to flourish on the racialized migrant women labor for care work and social reproduction. Thank you.
Would you like to collect a few questions, maybe 3 at a time?
Okay,
or...
okay, yeah.
All right, okay. Okay, who else? Or maybe I spoke too soon. There are not too many questions. Ramya, yes, please. Please introduce yourself. Mike? Here. Next in line, if I can see anyone.
Good evening, ma'am. I'm Ramya Ranjan Patel. I joined CESP this year. Last slide you mentioned labor enforcement to help improving the female labor force participation rate. India has implemented a wonderful legislation, 26 days maternity benefit leave, 26 days of maternity benefit leave to the women. But after this implementation, it has been seen, and there are studies to suggest that it has negatively worked on female labor force participation. The employer, they were discouraged to hire female labor force. The situation in OECD countries may be different, but in case of India, although we have very good legislation on maternity benefit, but it is working reverse. In this context, whether the enforcement will be a solution or not, I'm doubtful. Your opinion, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramya. Pradeep? Here. Professor Pradeep Singh Chauhan.
Thank you very much.
Loud.
Yes, my first
little loud.
Hello. Yes. So, in this scenario you presented, get the study of inequality. What the property rights can play the role in the equality, wage equality? And secondly, if you have some examples, kind of best practices anywhere in the world where we can give some examples.
I think she couldn't hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I repeat again.
Yeah.
Yeah. First is like how property rights can play the
Yeah.
role, and
Yeah.
second is if there is any best practices around the world where we can, mention about
Best
this.
practices on what? I'm sorry.
In terms of like wage equality or kind of state intervention or other kind of,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Professor Elson, floor is yours now.
Three very good questions. Yes, the labor markets of OECD countries are all marked by imperialism, colonialism, racialism. In a different and more recent paper, which just focuses on the UK and looks at what's happened during COVID and since COVID, I discuss the racialized nature of the labor market and the distribution of income and wealth as well. It is, especially on the distribution of wealth, it's hard enough. It's quite hard to get disaggregated data, both disaggregations by gender and by race. But there are some studies with this, and it is another important form of inequality that structures the distribution both of income and of wealth. It is a barrier very often because of racism to building collective bargaining power to challenge the inequalities. But that's also true of sexism, which has historically also been a barrier to building collective bargaining. But it can be challenged and overcome, and I think there are some workers' organizations that have done a lot to challenge racism as well as sexism. But you're right to say this is an ongoing issue. And if I'd had another hour, I could have brought in more of the data in my more recent paper, in a chapter in a book edited by Philip Orestes and Malcolm Sawyer. But that does focus a lot more on the UK. So I wanted to do something in this presentation that was broader. But those kinds of inequality, you have to challenge. Something like minimum wage will help deal, I think, both with class, with income inequality, with the class, with gender, and with race, because it is, of course, particularly women in racialized groups that are in I would say, let's call it non-white groups, that are concentrated in the most exploited part of the labor market. So this is definite, and I imagine in India you've also got issues not so much with race but with caste, that you also know their work goes on about how that also structures inequality. So yes, studying those multiple forms of intersecting inequality is important, and pushing for better data on them is also important. Thank you. On the maternity benefits, I'm not quite sure how it works in India, but I think throughout the world, if you make the employer responsible for paying the maternity benefit, it will have the impact that you suggest. Employers, it's an extra cost for them. They don't want to employ women. But if you fund the maternity benefit through general taxation, so it's not a specific cost to employers, financial cost, then the response will be different. But you also have to buttress it by anti-discrimination legislation so that women cannot be dismissed on the grounds that they become pregnant. So you have to have the combination of things, and unless that combination of things is in place, then you can have, if you make the employers responsible for paying for it and you don't have strong anti-discrimination legislation, including discrimination against pregnant women, then you're likely to have the kind of impact that you said had taken place in India. And on property rights, I didn't have time to say much about property rights, but property rights are important and complex. I say more in again, this later paper on the importance of challenging the underlying distribution of property rights. But I think it's corporate property rights in particular that need to be challenged and transformed to push back against this increasing concentration of income in the hands of a few rich people, which are going on all over the world, I think, and in increasing the share of capital in national income. So it's corporate property rights need to be changed. And there are a whole series of ways that that can be done, and what's the next step forward in any particular country will depend on the context in that country. There's also, of course, there's a lot of work that goes on the issue of inheritance rights. And I know there's a lot of work in India on inheritance rights. And my friend Bina Agarwal has done a lot of work on that. And I know it's complex because women may or may not be able to exercise new inheritance rights that they've got. So the change in law on property rights is always one step in improving in a real way the redistribution of property rights. I wasn't sure whether there was, oh, you asked for examples of things that might be done, and what I say out of my experience may not work for you in India. For instance, minimum wage is really important in an economy like the UK, but in an economy like India, where the wage workers are a small proportion of the total workers, it may be strategies around the self-organization of self-employed workers that are particularly important, and there have been some successes there, I know.
Thank you, Professor Elson. Nandan, you had, yes, Nandan and then Sonali. And yes, I can't see you from here, so yeah. Nandan,
Honor.
Sonali, and yes.
Professor El, my name is Nandan Kumar Jha, and I was a student here, and I did PhD in US, and now I teach there in Valdosta State University in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. My question to you is in terms of the strategies, the policy prescriptions that you have suggested to, ameliorate or reduce all these inequalities. May I ask you to elaborate and expound on you have suggested increased role, the expansion of the public sector from the government sector. How is that going to work? Because most economies, most countries in, have some political system, public sector, private sector, they exist together. So expansion in one sector may be at the, cost of another reduction in the size of another sector. So is there a sweet spot where, through political feasibility, the ideas, the strategies that you have suggested can be practically achieved.
Thank you. Sonali?
Thank you, Professor Elson, for an amazing talk. I'm Sonali Garg. I'm a former student at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Department of Economics. Regarding, you said something about the public sector, right? That how expanding the public sector would lead to probably more gender equality or better wages. In my own limited personal experience, I've had equally bizarre anti-feminist, comments, behavior, and suggestions in both equally in the private and the public sector. And if you could please elaborate why you would have more faith in the public sector as being better able to enforce gender equality in terms of wages or other opportunities. Thank you.
All right. So we have two more questions, Professor Elson. We'll take those and then that would be the last round. So please.
Okay, so I'll take the second question first, I think. Is it true that public sector employment is better for women than private sector employment? This will be contingent on a particular countries, and there's certainly inequality in the public sector in OECD countries. Just talk about the UK. Yeah, there is harassment in the public sector as well as the private sector. There is wage inequality in the public sector as well as the private sector. But all the data shows that the gender wage gap in the public sector is considerably lower than the gender wage gap in the private sector. And that is linked to the fact that the public sector there are more trade unions active in the public sector. So there can be collective bargaining, and collective bargaining systems tend to result in more gender equality. It's systems where it's individuals who have to go and bargain for their own income, where men seem to do a lot better than women. So I don't want to paint a picture that the public sector is a panacea. But it's certainly not the case if you have an outsourced public sector. Public services are not actually produced by publicly employed workers, but are produced by outsourced workers. Then there's low wages, and these tend to be often sectors in which are mainly female workers. So one thing is bringing back those services into the public sector, but the public sector is history, its size, the way it works is different in different countries, maybe different in different parts of India as well. So I'd hate to kind of give too much of a generalization on this, but I think there is capacity for public sector to produce better employment for women, but it doesn't always the case, and you certainly have to fight for that. And it's also, you have to think about different groups of women as well. Which groups of women are you talking about? And in terms of the if you like, the politics of expanding the public sector, in many cases this is kind of reclaiming a public sector that once did much better than it's doing now. And it's about reclaiming a public sector for the public to provide good quality services with good quality employment. There will be pushback against this, because to do that, you're probably going to need to raise taxes. And that's why it goes hand in hand with campaigns for tax justice. Tax justice is a very, very important part of the effort, I think, to combine greater gender equality with greater class equality with greater race equality. And although I don't think you've got to have the tax in hand before you can invest in the public services, certainly I think in many countries it will be much easier to do that investment in the good quality public services if you raise taxes. So there has to be tax justice. So so Piketty, of course, emphasizes taxing the wealthy a lot, and I think that's important. Although it's not the only answer, I think you also got to change the structure of property rights so that the rich aren't able to get so rich in the first place and then be in a good position to evade taxes of various kinds. I do think with many of these things, it's a combination of strategies that you need, and one by itself will not be enough. But thank you for your interesting, thoughtful questions. And I hope
Professor
you enjoy.
Elson, we have 2 more questions.
Oh, 2 more,
we
good.
take that. We can't do very much more than that because
Okay.
of time constraints, but we have 2 more. Sukanya?
Hello, am I audible? So I'm Diksha, currently studying in MA final in CESP itself. So ma'am, I have a question. So you have told that in 21st century, Piketty argued that women have low bargaining power and women are paid less because of their work could be replicated easily. Whereas some feminist economists argued that it's not because it is seen as something that comes naturally to them rather than seen as a learned skill. So because it is a social construct, so how can we deal it in a sociological context? Because we have talked about how it could be improved with respect to legislative policies, but if we talked about society as whole, so how these preconceived notions can be changed. And also we have talked about that public services should not be just financed, but also should be publicly provided. So could you talk about it in a more brief manner? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Diksha. Sukanya? Yes.
I can't hear, sorry.
Yeah, it's
Hello.
working.
Is it, am I audible? Yeah. So, thank you, Professor. That was a fascinating talk. My 2 quick questions is how do you define this care economy for which you are saying there should be 2% of GDP? I assume you are keeping the health and education sector out of that definition. So how exactly are you defining? And the other question relates to this gender budgeting. We have had now gender budgeting for the last 15 to 18 years, and it has really become a paper exercise here, and the system has been gamed. So what is your sense of it? Thank you.
Thank you, Sukanya. So, Professor Elson, back to you.
Okay, fine. So the ITUC study, which I referred to, which talked about the employment generation from investing 2% in construction or 2% in care, their care was defined in terms of care for preschool children. These are paid care services. Care for preschool children, care for people with disabilities who need care, care for frail elderly people. So those kinds of, it didn't include health and education. It was this narrower definition of paid care in these 3 particular areas. So it was about expanding preschool child care and education. It was about expanding care for non-medical care for frail elderly people and people with severe disabilities. That was the basis of that study. These kind of studies have actually been done now for quite a wide range of countries, including Turkey, including South Africa, quite a wide range of countries. And the ILO has a big program of work on what happens if you invest in care services. I think trying to make the point to finance ministers that the investment in care services is a bigger generator of jobs than, if that's what you're interested in, than in many other sectors of the economy. Also, some more recent studies show that it increases productivity if you invest in care services. And also other studies that have emphasized the fact that if you increase care services and increase this public care services, increase the number of people employed in them, that may increase your tax revenue because you have more people paying tax. So those are the kinds of studies that have been done, but often with this not including health and education, because finance ministers are more likely to see immediately the importance of health and education than they are of care services. Then you asked about gender budgeting. Well, I know that first I'd say different countries around the world approach gender budgeting in very different ways. There are many different ways of doing gender budgeting. I know you have an ongoing, long-standing process in India here, which to me as an outsider, it looks a bit like the description that you gave to it, that this is a paper exercise, because it focuses on a small proportion of the budget, really, and it doesn't transform the whole budget. But I've been hearing about processes in Kerala about gender and public finance that have a much more comprehensive approach to how you might want to take gender equality into account when making decisions about spending public money. So there are different approaches in different countries. All I'll say is when I started working on gender budgeting after the in the late 90s, in the aftermath of the IMF and World Bank stabilization and structural adjustment programs, the idea was to get economists and governments to think about the whole budget, the expenditure, the revenue, the borrowing from a gender equality point of view, and first do no harm. Do not introduce cuts that were going to increase gender inequality rather than reduce gender inequality. And then to look at the whole budget, not just to look at programs that are labeled specifically for women. The health service was only part of that, labeled explicitly for women, but children's health matters a lot in terms of women's unpaid work. The whole budget, unless you can really show me otherwise, has got a gender dimension to it. It's easier to show that in terms of public services that are directly consumed by people, but road building has a gender dimension. What you're spending on road building, you're not spending on other things you could spend on. So that's and with the kind of roads you build, is it huge highways that only big trucks can use, or are you building small all-weather feeder roads that will enable children to get to school? So I've not given up on gender budgeting because I can see some countries are doing quite interesting things. In Spain, the regional government of Andalusia has done very much more transformative approach to gender budgeting than I've seen in some other countries. So I think you also have to be aware of the fact there are many different ways of doing gender budgeting, and to perhaps focus on how we can make it more transformative and not simply a paper exercise.
Thank you so much, Professor Elson, for this absolutely and deeply satisfying talk, which generated so many questions and hopefully has inspired many of our young scholars to pursue these ideas and themes as they go ahead. So thank you so much again, and a very warm applause, please, for. Thank you. And thank you, Dean Professor Sharma, for chairing this session. It's been extremely helpful for us in terms of facilitating everything that we do, Professor Sharma's role is outstanding. In fact, he came back only today and then he agreed to chair this session. So thank you so much. And thank you, Seema, for being part of this conversation. So we close this session now, Professor Elson and everyone else. And we reconvene in about 10 minutes for the last session of the day. So, all right. So please try and get back in about 10 minutes.
Okay. Okay, bye then.
Hi, Professor Elson, sorry, just to apologize for the delay and everything.
No problem.
Fantastic.
No problem.
This is
I
Rohit.
hope you all
signing off.
enjoy the rest of the conference.
We would. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Professor Elson.